Welcome back to Building What We've Learned. You ever hear a story so wild that you have to change the requirements and the build-up to a video essay format that you're quite fond of? Yeah, we're talking about the Pied Piper today. It might be a real thing. The Pied Piper is a well-known folktale that has been retold and shared across continents and centuries. The commonly known version comes from a combination of two separate tales recorded in the Brothers Grimm German Legends book, the lesser-known companion to the Brothers Grimm Fairy Tales book. The story contains names and locations that connect to the real-life town of Hamel. However, ask anyone from that town, and they will tell you that the legend is true, and it doesn't involve any rodents. The modern story begins in the early months of 1284, as a handsome and colorfully dressed man enters the town claiming to be a rat catcher. He promises to help the town out with the plague of rats that have been flooding their streets in exchange for a large sum of payment. The town agrees, and the man pulls out a musical pipe and begins to play. To the tone of his music, rats and mice pour out of the buildings and begin to fill up the town square he is standing in. With the vermin in tow, the piper begins to walk towards the river Weser. When he reaches the water, he does not stop at its edge. Instead, he pulls up his clothes and begins to march straight in. The rodents follow him and drown in the waves. The story goes that the townfolks regret promising such a large payment to the man, and the mayor refuses to compensate him for his work. The stranger is left angry at the townspeople for not holding up their end of the bargain. Later that year, on June 26, the man returns. This time, he is not dressed in colorful clothes, but rather in a huntsman cloak, dressed in dark fabrics, topped with a shocking red hat. While the townsfolk gather in the church, the man begins to play his pipes. This time the children came running to the town square. All the children were older than 4, and among them was the daughter of the town's mayor. Once again, the piper played his song and began to leave the village, except this time he did not go to the river, but rather to the hills and the mountains where the group disappeared from sight. The last to see the group leave the village was a babysitter who was caring for an infant. She followed until the edge of the city, but did not leave its gates. Instead, she watched them vanish into the hills from the safety of the town. Not all the children who left with the piper disappeared, however. When the adults left the church and realized that their children were nowhere in sight, they began to search and only found 2 returning through the gate, claiming they were unable to keep up with the piper's dance. One was a small blind boy, and while he could not show where the children had been led, he told the adults of how they followed the piper's music through the streets and into the wild. The other boy was deaf, and while he had not heard the piper's songs, he was able to point to the place where the 2 children departed from the group. Only one other child, who was older than 4, survived that day. He was a small and thin child who was not dressed for the weather, and when the children began to leave the town's gates, he had turned back to fetch his jacket. When he tried to follow the piper again, they had already vanished out of sight. The place that the boy who was deaf pointed to as the last location they saw the piper was a large cave entrance within the mountains near the town. This cave is still there to this day, and the town of Hamel takes care to remember the story that ended there. This, at first read, is the full modern tale. However, on June 26, 1284, 130 children were led out of town by a man dressed in colorful stripes and a red hat. But history makes no mention of those rats. If you were to visit the town of Hamel in Germany, you would find a beautiful restaurant known as the Rat Catcher House. Within this building, an inscription was discovered that read, AD 1284. On the 26th of June, on the day of St. John and St. Paul, 130 children, born in Hamel, were led out of the town by a piper wearing multicolored clothes. After passing the cavalry near the Koppenberg, they disappeared forever. From this small inscription, several parts of the modern story begin to hold historical value. The Pied Piper was described as a colorfully dressed man, pied being an old word to describe something multicolored divided by patches or stripes. The year, location, and number of children taken all remain consistent with the Grimm brothers story in The Children of Hamel. The location, cavalry near Koppenberg, literally means place of death or execution site near the head of a mountain, which, coincidentally, is exactly where the cave that the children disappeared to lays today. The town later had a stained glass window built to remember this tragedy. Unfortunately, this art piece was destroyed in the 1600s, along with much of the original church. But many recreations have been made based off of its well-documented description. In 1384, an entry was made in Hamel's town's record stating that it's been 100 years since our children left, and they did not know what happened to them. 130 children disappeared. The street they were marched down banned music from ever being played on its roads again, and the mountain pass they were last seen on had a cross and memorial built. The first written record of this tragedy of the colorful piper comes from a 1311 publication of the city's chronicle. This being only 27 years after the children went missing, it was likely meant to record the historical event. However, none of these chronicles have survived in their original states in the modern day, and the oldest records historians have access to is from 1370. It is a small, handwritten footnote at the bottom of a collection of biblical commentary owned by a monk scribe. The scribe claimed to have read this tale in an older book. The footnote states that on the feast day of St. John and St. Paul, a 30-year-old handsome man who was finely dressed in colorful fabrics entered into the town and began to play on his silver pipe. He played while he moved through the town, and as the children heard him, 130 left their homes and followed. Together they went past the eastern gates towards the Gallow Field. There they vanished, and no one could find where they went. Mothers went to neighboring cities in attempts to find them, but none could be located. A voice was heard in Ramah as mothers began to cry. The mother of Herr Jean Deleu, the deacon, was the last to see the children as they left the city. There are several other written accounts of this tragedy occurring that were recorded within the lifetime of the children being taken. A notable one was believed to have been written in the choir book of the deacon, the son of the eyewitness. The choir book itself has not survived, but versions of the story can still be found in old manuscripts. None of these accounts, however, include rats. The plague of vermin did not appear in the story of the Pied Piper until the late 1500s, first noted within the Zimmerman family chronicle. A small version of the Pied Piper story where the man was described as a rat catcher instead of an unknown stranger. For almost 300 years, rats were not included. Some of the more prominent theories on why vermin began to appear in the story claim that it's likely a biblical reference. The voice in Ramah, noted in the footnote of the monk from 1370, is a reference to the book of Matthew, which discusses the massacre of the innocents. A story where all the boys in Bethlehem who were younger than 2 were killed. The massacre of innocents is often considered a metaphor by modern historians, as no solid archaeological evidence has been found. And the voice of Ramah is the weeping mothers who outlived their children. As mentioned at the start of this video, the Pied Piper as we know today is a combination of 2 tales from the Brothers Grimm folk legend book. The Children of Hamel, legend 245, has the piper first leading rats away and then children. But the second story, legend 246, is simply called the Rat Catcher, and is a much shorter legend. A rat catcher sounds a tone 9 times on his pipe to get the rats to follow to his will. One day, the rat catcher is brought to a village to the rhythm of the vermin. The rat catcher uses his pipes to make a simple hazel wooden stick that all the rats would follow. He then waits until Sunday to lay the stick out in front of the church door. When a millerman finds it, he decides it would be a good walking stick for his hike back out of the city towards the field where his mill is located. As the man begins to walk, the rats move to follow him out of the city, and soon chase the man into his house where the rats would stay forever. So what happened? Who is this handsome stranger who appeared in the German town wearing colorful stripes and a red hat? And why rats? The rats may have been added as a result of a wider trend in European stories from the 1500s. Stories of rats flooding European towns and rat catchers attempting to chase them out. The 1500s was the time when the second wave of the bubonic plague swept through Europe. The Black Death first began to spread long after the Children of Hamel disappeared. Once making its way across the continent, it never truly went away. Instead, it only began to crop up in small, isolated outbreaks. However, a new variant allowed a pandemic-level spread right across the 1500s, the time when stories of rat catchers began to appear in history. But that doesn't answer the question of what happened to the children in the first place. The bubonic plague did not begin until 1340, over 50 years after the children had already disappeared. But even if it wasn't the Black Death, that doesn't mean a mass illness wasn't involved. Dr. Dirks wrote what is now a famous essay called The Piper of Hamel, a medical historical interpretation. He believed that the history of the children disappearing was likely connected to murine typhus. This is a type of illness that is transmitted by rat fleas in a similar way the Black Death is. If a large group of rats died around the city, it would not be unlikely for young restless children to be paid to clean them up. Thus, they would come in contact with the fleas without it transferring onto their parents. This essay was written before the information of the rats being a modern addition to the story became widespread, and so it doesn't account for other ways the children could have gotten sick. It is worth noting that rat catchers were frequently considered tricksters or even magicians who would play cruel pranks on citizens. You may have heard a version of the story where the rat catchers would bring rats into the town themselves just so they could get paid for their work. They became metaphors for cruel pranksters and frequently went after those who crossed them in some way. As for the Pied of the Piper, marine typhus is an illness that causes those infected to be covered in brightly colored red and pink splotches. It doesn't take a very large leap in logic to see how the story of a march out of town, with all the children disappearing with them, from the church to the death hill, can come from one large single funerary procession, with a single gravesite for all who fell victim. However, this theory proposed by the essay connects rats back to the original tale, which, as mentioned, wasn't actually brought up in the original stories. And, as the first mention of the Piper was in the town's newsletter only 27 years after the children's disappearance, the idea of an illness being personified so quickly seems unlikely. The modern story is also firmly tied to the church, the children being taken on a saint's holiday while all the adults and infants had gathered at service. It was common practice at the time for the churches to take popular folktales and use them as a form of parable, a story to teach religious practices and morals. The children who did not attend the church heard the pipers' calls and were led away. In a 1556 account from the church, one of the earliest published versions of this tale that we still have access to, the piper is replaced by the devil, who lures children away as punishment for the town's sins, those who are not in church being the ones sent to die. One of the more historically based theories that has gained popularity in the past few years is that of mass immigration. The time that the children disappeared lines up with the movement to attempt to settle Eastern Europe. Men known as locators would dress up in fancy, colorful clothes provided by local lords to give the impression of wealth that was waiting for them in the East. These men were frequently accompanied by musicians who played drums or silver pipes. However, people who moved east during this time were typically the second or third born children of noble houses, those who had inherited no land of their own and were able to leave without much worry. Small children of townsfolk were likely not approached by these locators, as they would be unable to help build the town and run farms in the new settled regions, frequently areas near East Prussia or Transylvania. Modern-day researchers have also been unable to connect any last names of the Germanic families that settled in these areas to the area of Hamel. The final historically based theory revolves around the failed children's crusades in the early 1200s. The intent of these children's crusades was to use children of the Christian faith to try and peacefully convert Muslims without the loss of life. It is worth noting that these crusades were not approved by the Pope, and instead was a march of children to the sea, which, as the modern story claims, the Crusaders believed would part for them and the innocents. When the ocean failed to do so, the children were placed onto merchant ships and died either at sea or sold as slaves in foreign land. Historically, there were likely two separate events that involved marching children from France through the Alps towards the Mediterranean Sea. Many died or turned home early, and those who made it through Switzerland were taken in by the people in the Italian city of Genoa. Both these crusades happened in the year 1212, which once again was not within the time frame of the Pied Piper. So what happened? A man came into town and left with 130 small children. A babysitter watched it happen, and the town remembered that story. The details were lost, and the first accounts have been destroyed, but the story is still there, rats or otherwise. We may never know what happened to the 130 children of Hamel. Over 700 years later, and the town has become the heart of German folklore, decorating itself in memories of its history, and welcoming those who dared and tried to solve its past. Or simply, those who came to eat at the restaurant decorated with rats. Thank you guys for watching. This video was a different kind of research process for me, so I really hope it turned out well. It was such a fascinating story to hear about, especially because I've heard it before. My German teacher used to tell it, though she would tell it in German, and I didn't fully understand what she was saying at the time. I have a few more video essays planned for November and December, so I super hope you guys are looking forward to that, because I promise you it is going to be a fun time. Until then, I'll see y'all later. Bye!